All for joining today's webinar titled Identifying Innovations to Reduce Food Loss and Waste, Enhance Food Safety, and Promote Access to Nutrient-Dense Foods Across the Food System. My name is Maha Sheikh, and I am the Communications Specialist at the Food Systems for Nutrition Innovation Lab at Tufts University. As more attendees are joining the webinar, I will begin by going over some of the logistical items. Next, please. I would like to direct all attendees to a few functions on this Zoom call. At the bottom of your screen, you should see a chat icon and a Q&A icon. Please use the chat feature to engage in relevant conversation with the other attendees. Next, please. If you have a question for our speaker, please use the Q&A feature. We have allotted the final 20 minutes of this webinar for Q&A. And if you're experiencing any technical difficulties, please send a message in the chat to panelists so that our technical support staff can assist you. This webinar is being recorded and will be made available following the event. Next, please. I would now like to introduce Dr. Patrick Webb, who will be the moderator for today's session. Dr. Patrick Webb is the Alexander McFarland Professor of Nutrition at the Friedman School of Nutrition Science and Policy. Until 2005, Dr. Webb was the Chief of Nutrition at the United Nations World Food Program in Rome. Today, he is the Director of the Feed the Future Food Systems for Nutrition Innovation Lab. He has served on numerous task forces and global advisory panels, including currently serving on the high-level panel of experts of the Committee on World Food Security. He is technical advisor to the Global Panel on Agriculture and Food Systems for Nutrition, and serves as one of the commissioners for the ongoing Eat Lancet 2.0 study. Patrick, over to you.
Well, thank you, Maha. And hello, everyone. It's wonderful to be here and to be back again in one of these webinar settings. Looking forward to active participation among many of you and interesting questions, as always. So it's great to be part of this new innovation lab. I'm going to introduce Shabani just in 1 second to actually make the main presentation, but I did want to just start very briefly by saying a little bit about what we mean by innovation. There's a lot of calls, many of you know about these calls for transformation of food systems. That came to a crescendo during the UN Food Systems Summit of just over a year ago, but it continues to grow. People arguing that we need transformation of our food systems to be not only within planetary boundaries, but also to protect human health through improved nutrition. And that requires a lot of policy changes. It requires demand changes on the demand side, on the consumer side. It also requires close attention to what can be done in the food system in terms of innovation at a scale that is necessary to make healthy diets available to everyone and affordable. And that includes reducing food loss and waste, for example, and enhancing food safety and making nutrient-rich foods more available to more people. And so in this space, innovation typically doesn't come in the form of a single thing, like an invention that creates its own demand. Innovation, it could be a technology, it could be a novel practice, it could be a new set of policies. But as Lawrence Haddad, director of GAIN here, is arguing, bundling of innovations, facilitation, enabling of innovations is really important next. They typically don't go to scale of their own accord. And as Claudia Sadoff, the head of CGIAR, also says, this is always about partnership. There's many stakeholders in the food system and therefore many stakeholders in making innovations both feasible and successful. So facilitated policies, institutions, and systems from supply through to demand are the order of the day. Next, please. And the Director General of the International Food Policy Research Institute has also said that the success in innovations requires a lot of things to work together, enabling market conditions, regulatory systems, and the environment in which people choose their foods, right? So it's not just about a technology. It's much more than that. And we need to think more holistically about innovation for nutrition through the food system. Next. And that is really what we're about in this innovation lab. FAO has talked also about the need for evidence to support innovation, and that is essential. And research for development in terms of what is the business model, how to validate the success and the impact of innovations, particularly when they are bundled in various ways, is really crucial, right? So we need evidence of what works in this space, just as we do in the space that informs policies and other kinds of practices. Next, please. Now, this is really important, not just at a global level, but almost especially so at the local level. And this Food Systems for Nutrition Innovation Lab is at the outset focusing on 4 countries: Nepal, Bangladesh, Malawi, and Mozambique. And each of these countries has, in its own right, in the context of last year's UN Food Systems Summit, elaborated what they call it, they have different terms for it, but essentially national pathways towards transformation. And you can find all of those on the web, but what I want to highlight is that in each of these cases, there is a clear articulation of the need for engagement with stakeholders along value chains between production and consumption, which in many cases means private sector of all kinds. And in Nepal, you can see focus on private sector in not just production, but value addition and engagement specifically to focus on the promotion and distribution of healthy foods and promotion of dietary patterns that are in themselves healthy. And a lot of that requires value chain development of different kinds with new technologies and practices with the private sector, right? So it's not just a public, so government or consumer domain. A lot has to go on in the middle. The next, please. That was Nepal's pathway. Bangladesh also has a defined national pathway, and they also talk about the need for inputs in terms of processing, storage, packaging, transformation, and marketing of all kinds, not just of foods, but of services related to foods, to be able to make affordable, accessible, healthy diets a reality for everyone. Part of that, as I said at the beginning, requires attention to reducing food loss and waste along value chains, and therefore focus in this case on infrastructure, technologies, storage, and so on, right? So a lot of the similar kinds of innovations needed in different points along the value chain. Next, last 2 slides. Malawi, going to Southern Africa, recognizes current food systems, including in Malawi, not sustainable. They require transformation, and that there requires greater interdigitation and linkage, for example, in terms of infrastructure, cold chain, with processing, storage, trade, and again, the focus on nutrient-rich foods. And then next slide, finally, Mozambique, which again is very much talking about the active role of all stakeholders, including the private sector, in the transformation of food systems from production through to distribution and sale, and the importance of small and medium enterprises along the value chain to make that happen. Next. So this is an important agenda that this innovation lab is undertaking in collaboration with all other innovation labs. And our focus is primarily, not exclusively, but primarily post-farm gate, and a big focus not just on those 4 countries, but on what will it take to identify, bundle, scale innovations that can improve nutrition through improved healthy diets, and then generate the evidence of impact. That is the broad agenda. Next, please. Obviously, it's a big task. In this innovation lab, we have a large number of collaborators listed out here, all bringing different kinds of expertise and experiences to bear. And we're always looking for new partners and collaborators through this kind of work. I'm going to hand over now to Professor Shubhani Ghosh, who's going to talk in a little more detail about what this Innovation Lab has been doing in its first year of being stood up, and where we're heading in this kind of work. Dr. Ghosh is well known to so many of you. She's nutrition trained and very experienced across the world in terms of policy development, multi-sector programming, and now in this space of innovation development and scaling. And I hand over to you, Shubhani, to take it away.
Thanks, Patrick, for the very gracious introduction, and afternoon, evening, morning, wherever everyone is joining from. I think before I sort of jump into some of the things we want to share with you, I just want to sort of highlight the goals of our lab are threefold. One is to support and generate evidence on scalable nutrition-sensitive food system technologies and practices. And within that context, also to build capacity in our partner countries, but also within the United States. And lastly, and very critically important, is stakeholder engagement across both public and private sector businesses and academics. And within this sort of context, we undertook a series of activities or scoping exercises in what was the year one of our lab activities. And so if you could go to the next slide, please. And we called it a scoping exercise because the idea is that we wanted to understand what are the challenges, needs, and opportunities within the context of innovation, whether generating evidence around innovation or building capacity in the scale up of innovations. And so with the support, very, very active engagement and support of our partners, we conducted scoping exercises to generate a census of innovations that were out there and prioritize those innovations using scalability tools. And in addition to that, if you could just click next, please, Jen, thank you. We also wanted to undertake the exercise to have a better understanding of the HICD needs in the focus geographies that we would work in and outline the stakeholder landscape, as well as the type of engagement that would be critical in the success of our engagement in these geographies. Now, with respect to the main part of the scoping exercise, we conducted a census of innovations through literature reviews, through searches, through existing knowledge and networks of our core partners, and then undertook a prioritization of those list of innovations. Now, the prioritization was undertaken using the agricultural scalability tool that has been developed by USAID. We had it modified so that it could meet the needs of this exercise. There was internal feedback and consensus generation to finalize the prioritized list, and then identification of on-the-shelf innovations that might be of interest within the context of the geographies we want to work in. So if you click the next slide. Now, obviously, when you're thinking about the food system, a scoping exercise like this would need to have some kind of boundaries to it. And what we went with was the boundaries of the value chain and conducted four actually by value chain, by the thematic area of a value chain exercises. And so what you see here is themes 1 through 4, which use the value chain lens. And we start from agricultural production, harvest and post-harvest losses, everything that's on farm. Theme 2 focused on post-farm gate, processing, packaging, and storage. Theme 3 focused on markets and distribution, infrastructure, transport, and markets. Theme 4 focused on the food environment, consumer choice, and retail promotion. So these were using a value chain lens across the food system. And then we had a 5th theme that was primarily focused on metrics, both food system and nutrition metrics. Now, each of our partners, as Patrick has shown in his last slide, we have a huge and a valuable set of partners. And we had, out of that group, 5 partners that agreed to lead these exercises. So theme 1 was led by Purdue University. Theme 2 was by University of Colorado. Theme 3 was by Action for Enterprise. 4 was by GAIN, and 5 was by Harvard University. And these theme leads were essentially tasked to undertake this scoping exercise in collaboration with all the other partners as well as Tufts University. We had 10 members in each thematic group, working group, which accounted to about 50 to 60 experts across those 20 institutions that we partner with. Next slide, please. Just to give you an idea of the process, we essentially, each scoping lead set up their working groups, developed outlines. We had guidelines and templates that were developed by Tufts University that were shared with the scoping lead. But in essence, each and every one of those thematic exercises was undertaken by that scoping lead in collaboration with the working group partners. And each group worked differently and convened working group meetings, whether virtually on a regular basis, and undertook the scoping exercises and facilitated the internal consultations. And they finalized and submitted scoping exercises to Tufts and to us, the management team, in August 2022. Next slide, please. So what we have in this particular slide are the outputs of 4 of those exercises, which use the value chain lens, which is theme 1, agricultural production, to theme 4, the food environment. And the focus of the presentation moving forward is going to be on these 4 themes. Our theme 5, which is metrics, that is, as you all can imagine, when you're looking at metrics across the food system, there's a considerable amount of information that has to be unpackaged, and we feel that that sort of deserves a separate discussion. So for the purpose of this presentation, we will be focusing on these 4 themes. We are almost finalizing these reports, and they will be available for dissemination across all our partners and networks. Next slide, please. So once we received the information from each of the scoping leads, on the Tufts end, we conducted a descriptive analysis of the census. So we combined the innovation lists from each of the scoping exercises and conducted a few descriptive analyses. So first thing that we wanted to outline was, based on our review of the data, there were a total of 276 innovations across these 4 themes that focused on nutrient-dense foods, food loss and waste, and food safety. These are our priority areas as a lab. And of course, this is not a mutually exclusive list, because some of these innovations can target more than one priority area. What you see on this slide is a breakdown of these innovations by geographic region. Because one of the questions we had is that, yes, it will be great if there are innovations out there, but are they actually available and or accessible within the geographies we focus in, and or have they been tested or implemented in those? And what you see here is there is a considerable number of innovations that have been tested across South Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa, but also in Latin America and the Middle East. On the right side, what you see is a stacked bar chart where we show the distribution of innovations by themes. And here we are presenting 3 of the themes: ag production, post-farm gate, and then the food environment. You do see quite a few innovations that are actually have been tested and or have potential of being implemented in South Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa. Next slide, please. In terms of innovations by priority areas, when you break it down, what you see is that quite a few of them are focused on nutrient-dense foods, as well as food loss and waste, and not that many on food safety. Next slide, please. We also examined the innovations with respect to what type of food group, and some of them would be applicable for more than one nutrient-dense food group. And what you see on the left side is a pie chart of all the innovations, irrespective by food group, excuse me. And on the right side, what you see is the innovations by food group and by country. And what you see is that you see quite a few innovations in fruits and vegetables. And then you will find less so on poultry, fish, dairy, eggs, livestock products, and a few emerging on grains and tubers. And it's not because these don't exist in grains and tubers. I think within the context of our remit, we were focused on nutrient-dense foods, but we also had elements of food safety in our remit, which probably is why we have innovations around ensuring food safety in grains and tubers. Next slide, please. We examined the type of innovation from what exactly the innovation is. And obviously most of us think about innovations and technologies as products. But as Patrick has mentioned, that the term innovation goes beyond products. It also includes processes, it includes practices, it includes policy responses. And so in the list of innovations that we had, we were able to classify them based on whether they were products, they were processes, or practices. And we also identified some metrics and tools in our 4 thematic exercises. So what you see on the left side is most of the innovations we have in our list are actually products. Some processes and practices, and a few metrics, but we're not too worried about the metrics because we know we have an entire thematic exercise on metrics. And on the right side, what you can see is by geography. Again, we see Bangladesh seems to have the most innovations that have been either tested and or implemented, though we do see Malawi, Mozambique, and Nepal also have a substantial number. The critical point here is, again, the list of innovations that we are seeing are primarily products and technologies. Next slide, please. We also assessed the data that came in from our scoping exercises in terms of what stage of development are these innovations, and they could range from proof of concept, they're in the R&D cycle, they're transitioning to scale, they're at scale, or they are in sustained scale. And what was interesting to find is that many of the innovations that have been identified are actually at the scale level. And that seemed to resonate across the different countries. Not so much at sustained scale, as you will notice. Next slide, please. We kind of then divided the innovation depending upon upstream versus downstream. And the rationale for doing this was we were trying to determine which are the innovations that we would like to target within the context of research for development strategy. And this is so just looking at it from the perspective of upstream versus downstream. And for us, downstream is defined as innovations that are transitioning to scale, or they are at scale, or they are at sustainable scale. So again, we do find a lot of the innovations that we have identified in this initial census are essentially downstream innovations. Next slide, please. And I just want to sort of take a step away from that descriptive analysis and talk a little bit about a thought exercise that we conducted between Patrick, Robin Shrestha, and myself as we were assessing and understanding the data that was emerging from these 4 scoping exercises. As Patrick noted, the concept of bundling and that innovations cannot have a standalone and they might need to be implemented either in conjunction with each other or in conjunction with policy responses or regulatory oversight is something that is really have been highlighted across the community that works in this space. So we took this idea of bundling and applied it to our list of innovations. And I'm going to give you 2 examples. One is on improving egg consumption, and the other one is reducing food safety risks. So what you see on this slide is we assessed across the 4 thematic exercises, the 4 scoping exercises, we identified those innovations that support improving egg consumption in young children. So I just want you to look on the right side of your screen, and what you see here are the innovations that would, if they are linked together, will support improving egg consumption. On the left side in the table, what you're seeing is the stage of development that these innovations are in. And the key thing that we wanted to point out here is that not all the innovations are likely to be at the same stage of development. Some might be still at proof of concept, as you can see, traditional knowledge or oil coating of eggs that was identified as a post-farm gate innovation. And others might be more at scale and sustainable scale, whether it's rapid testing for salmonella or for active packaging. So the key point here is this is very much as just to highlight that this is a thought exercise. The idea that we had was we really need to think about A, how do we bundle innovations to achieve a certain goal or outcome? And B, if we do that, are we able to identify innovations that are within the same stage of development? Now, if you go to the next slide, please. Here, I want to sort of illustrate the same example using the concept of reducing post-harvest loss of grains and food safety risks. What you see on the right side are a list of a group of innovations. And what you will note is that these are mostly products that have been identified across the value chain that have been either tested or are in implementation mode, whether it's dryers or PICS bags or netting bags or dry cards that have been utilized across the value chain to reduce post-harvest loss of grains and or reduce food safety risks. And what you note is that, in fact, they're all at different stages. This example is slightly different from the previous one because they are most of these innovations are more closer to transition to scale and scaling. But the key highlight here is that if we would like to really ensure that we reduce loss of grains, reduce food safety risks, one is going to have to create bundles of innovations to address that issue. Next slide, please. In essence and in short, some of the work that we have done on those post completion of the scoping exercises has really highlighted the fact that a lot of the innovations that we are seeing in our target countries, in other low and middle income countries, are primarily focused on products and technologies, less so on processes, practices, and behaviors around uptake of those products or those technologies. We also think that we really need to push forward and dwell further into the concepts of bundling of innovations to support action at scale. You could use the concepts of social technical bundling or context-specific bundling, as Patrick has pointed out. What you note here is that I don't make any reference to innovations around policy or innovations around regulatory guidance, because that is something, those are critical elements, but they are not part of our list of innovations. I do think that it's important to note that one of the outcomes of sort of the review of the innovations is that we need rigorous empirical evidence, particularly around effectiveness, cost effectiveness of innovations, whether they are processes or products or practices and behaviors. And in particular, we also need to understand and be able to make the business case for some of these innovations. Clearly, engaging not just the public sector, but also the private sector will be critical. And that's something that Patrick has highlighted. Across all the different countries, you do see that clear awareness and understanding that private sector engagement is critical. But in the end of the day, scaling of those innovations really does require a conducive policy environment. But at the same time, there needs to be regulatory oversight, as well as an efficient market system, transportation, and infrastructure. So thank you very much for listening to me. I think we have next steps. Excuse me, if you go to the next slide, please. I just want to give a little update. I apologize. A little update on where we are at. Thanks to our real hard work of our partners, we've been able to finalize the census and the prioritization exercise. And on the Tufts end and the management end, we are fine-tuning the focus of our RFA using the findings of these exercise. And we anticipate releasing our first RFA by December 8th. So coming up very shortly. We would like to really release the list of innovations and the reports from the 4 exercises for review and feedback, and also have engagement in countries and to get perspectives from external stakeholders in countries as well as across the food systems community. So thank you very much for listening to me, and I'm going to hand it back to Patrick for Q&A.
Okay, well, thank you, Shubhani. So several things left out of me there. One is that this is a lot of work by a lot of people, and it's going to continue in that way. This was a first round of scoping to inform a first round of calls for proposals for supporting empirical research in this space. And as Shubhani said, we're hoping to release that first call within a week or 10 days. So look out for that. And then secondly, there certainly are lots and lots of innovations out there, but one of the key constraining factors, what are the key constraining factors? Because some of those innovations have been around actually for a very long time. And so even if they are classified as scaling, meaning perhaps being validated or adopted at various scales in a number of different countries, it's not always entirely clear at what point do we get liftoff. At what point can we get a rapid uptake or commercialization or adoption by governments to deliver through extension agents and so on. A lot of innovations don't seem to have reached that point yet. And so what we need to understand more about is how, in the context of these target geographies and the regions around them, what will it take? What kinds of evidence do we need still? Where do we go from here in terms of how we make innovations get to scale? There's a lot to be understood here. So if there are questions or comments, please jump in the box. One question that came up right at the front, which I did answer, Shivani, was how, basically on the how of scoping, and we didn't rely just on peer-reviewed publications, but this is a kind of space where you have to very much look at business journals and technology bulletins and work through networks of contacts to try and identify who has been working on what in what context. Do you want to add to that, Shivani, or is that? I mean, that's essentially what we did.
Yeah, no, and I think there was lots of discussion across the board on how do we conduct this, and given the timeline, but also given that we want this this is a starting point for us, and by no means is this a comprehensive census. I think that's one thing we failed to highlight, Patrick, that for us, this is a starting point of understanding what's out there. But by no means is this comprehensive or is it complete. We feel like there will be additions being made to this list as we go along. And you're right, that's why we wanted to do something that allowed us to get us start up, but not necessarily, we didn't have the time. So we actually utilized approaches of literature reviews, but also making sure that our scoping working groups were interacting with each other, but also with their networks in identifying innovations that are out there in both the peer-reviewed as well as the gray literature. So yes, I think that's definitely. But I do want to point out that, in fact, what I'm sort of realizing now that we have some colleagues down in Nepal who are interacting on the kind of innovations that are being assessed or tested in Nepal, that there are things out there in the countries that we are going to be working in that may not be on this list. And so our next step really is to engage with our in-country counterparts to assess this list and maybe build on top of it. And so by no means is this a comprehensive and a process that is completed.
Right, exactly. And as I said, it's a first off, and what it is really clearly, it's bringing questions, not necessarily answers. It's bringing questions to the fore, relating to the knowledge gaps that we need to fill. And no question that there's a lot more out there. And one thing in terms of next steps is a series of consultations in those 4 countries, especially with young entrepreneurs and businesses, as well as researchers and policymakers, right? To try and get a sense of what is known in terms of having potential in those geographies and what could we build on. So Grant was asking, when will they be published? They will be published as soon as they're formally approved by USAID, and hopefully on our new website, which has been delayed. But the Food Systems for Nutrition Innovation Lab, we're really hoping we'll have a website up and going in the coming days, or if not, hopefully days, if not weeks. And we are exploring the potential grant for publishing that as a set, potentially to get to a wider audience. A couple of questions have come in. Stacia in Malawi, great to see your name pop up, highlighted the fact that actually often things have been known for a very long time. For example, around indigenous species that can be harvested year round, and often missing from conversations around food safety or food loss and waste, for example. So there are clearly a lot of things in that space, right, that we could explore. And Andrew, I'll throw this to you, Tivani. Andrew Thorne-Lyman, who's one of our collaborators, was curious to hear our thoughts on how standardized approaches have been assessing whether an innovation works prior to scaling across different categories of innovation. Essentially, how is this done, today? Or, I'm guessing the question really is, how could we do things differently or better? Are there standardized approaches to assessing whether an innovation works? Over to you.
So, okay, so I'm not sure I completely, Andrew, I'm not sure whether he means it from the perspective of the scoping exercises, but I think, let me try to take a stab at this. One of the things we have realized is that across this value chain, where you go from production to consumer behavior, what is definitions of what is an innovation, and is it differ depending upon which area or discipline you're working in? One. Two is what you find is that the assessment of whether this is going to be scalable is different if you're in agriculture versus if you're working in consumer behavior. So I don't know, Andrew, whether this answers your question about standardization. So what we found was in the scoping exercises, within each scoping exercise, you could standardize the concepts of scale and sustainability, but across thematic areas, it might have been difficult to do. Yeah, I think, Andrew, that's what you were trying to say. Yeah. And I do think that is the inherent issue that one faces, that what can be done for standardization in agriculture may not work in consumer behavior or preferences. What might be considered as what might be considered as an innovation in one theme may not necessarily be an innovation. So there are distinct definitions, there are distinct differences in definitions because of the inherent difference in the disciplines involved in this food systems assessments, if you will. Andrew, I don't know if that sort of helps and answers what you're coming from, but yes, we face that, and we acknowledge it, that by no means does across the thematic areas, are they going to all have the same resonance?
And just to turn that in another way, is we're not purely applying an academic lens, right? This is, so much of this requires expertise from stakeholders, entrepreneurs, users, and what a user what an adopter can use in one context isn't always the same in another context. So we're very alert to the need to be listening, right? We're not coming at this with a standardized scientific method, but trying to understand what is going on. Now, William has been asking what areas of collaboration or implementation in different countries to boost smallholder farmer income. So I'm not still fully understanding the question, William, but if you're focused on implementation or adoption, maybe that's the term, of innovations, that is one of the key questions that we're focusing on, which is what is the appropriate delivery for any given innovation, whether it's a technology or a practice, right? Just because it exists doesn't mean it gets to the potential adopters or the right people. So figuring out innovation in delivering new ideas or new technologies is as important as the innovations in technologies themselves. By which I mean, some innovations can be delivered through extension agents from the Ministry of Agriculture to farmers, for example. But once you leave the farm gate, that mechanism, that delivery mechanism may not be available to stakeholders who are more in processing or transportation or storage work, let alone to consumers. Right? And commercial mechanisms can work to reach a large potential adopter group of adopters. But again, not all commercial players are active in all locations that are relevant or where we want to see diets improved, right? So identifying the right delivery mechanism and business model for this kind of work to be done cost effectively is pretty important. Shivani, I see our friend and former collaborator Devendra Gautam from Nepal asking, are there specific innovations effective in reducing food loss and waste that we've been looking at? I mean, I'll preface that by saying, no, I won't preface it. I'll hand that to you, Shivani. Go ahead. Okay. Are there specific innovations, or are we only looking at certain categories?
I think the Devendraji, I think if you noted from one of our slides, out of all the innovations, about over 100 of them target food loss or waste. And, if I have to give a sort of a specific example, something like a rapid testing kit for salmonella, which is a product, but it's about sort of reducing the risk of salmonella. So that one actually is both food safety and reducing food loss. Could be an example if that's what you were looking for. So there are over 100 innovations across the value chain that have been tested and or are being implemented around food loss or waste. The key point here is the focus of our census was really on from a food group perspective, it was really the nutrient-dense foods. So we do have innovations to support reducing loss and waste of grains. So I think the innovations around would be primarily around fruits and vegetables, poultry, fish, dairy, to some extent eggs. I use the example for eggs, but you see a lot more with fruits and vegetables actually. Mm-hmm. I hope that answers your question, Devendraji.
And it relates a little bit to Ahmed's simple questions about, are there innovations that do multiple things? Like same question: food loss and waste, food safety. I gave the example of PICS bags, which I won't say originally, but certainly reduce loss in terms of seed protection, but also reduce loss to rodents and also food safety by controlling mycotoxins. So in fact, many of the innovations that are in the improved storage and processing, cooling or drying, do multiple things in that way: food safety and food loss and waste, as well as protecting nutrient availability. So actually, post-farm gate, a lot of the things that are done to foods to enable them to reach a consumer in a relatively good way, protecting the nutrients and their integrity, have multiple beneficial outcomes. Climate impacts or resilience, that's a somewhat separate category that we're still working on. And improving nutrition based on the kinds of foods, the nutrient dense, mainly perishable foods that Shivani was talking about, is where we're looking next, essentially.
Yeah.
Emmanuel was asking, it wasn't asking, he was saying he's not surprised there's more innovations at upstream production level.
Yeah. Could I make
fewer.
Could I
Yeah,
clarify
no, I was going to
that?
ask you to answer that. Yeah.
So Emmanuel, just want to clarify that, we don't have a lot of metrics here not because they aren't there, because we do have a separate thematic exercise on metrics. We just happen to have our group leads in the first 4 themes also identified some metrics and tools. And a lot of the tools are actually things like digital tools, technology, apps for, better marketing information or price information. So I just want to highlight the fact that it's not because they don't exist. We do have a separate thematic exercise.
Right.
And I think sorry, I'm just going back to, Patrick moves faster than I do, but I'm trying to find Emmanuel's.
Oh, sorry, I moved it to answer.
Yes, I'm seeing it. Yeah. So I think, and I think we do actually, and again, sort of re-emphasizing the point that what is you will find a lot more products and technologies on the agriculture, sort of the production end. And you will find more processes and sort of practices and sort of behavior interventions more on the consumer end. So that is an inherent difference in that we do find, and that is likely to exist because of just the nature of the food system itself. So I think that that sort of makes this a much more complex analysis, and that's sort of also something that we need to always keep in mind when we talk about food systems transformation. But what does that mean? It means maybe scaling up products and technologies on one end, but also ensuring that there is demand on the other end, which requires different types of innovations and innovative activities. So I think that's really a critical point that I kind of learned in this process of undertaking these or interacting with all the leads who are working on these scoping exercises.
Mm-hmm. So, Bruce, are we looking outside these 4 countries? Well, those are our initial 4 target geographies.
Yeah. Sorry, may I jump in, Patrick?
Of course.
So Bruce, just to, yes, the innovations that were identified were agnostic initially to the country. We classified them to what region. We asked our scoping groups to identify what regions they have been tested or implemented in and or have potential for implementation. And so in essence, yes, this goes beyond the 4 countries, but we did want to understand if it's possible from the context of the region, whether it's Sub-Saharan Africa or South Asia or Southeast Asia or Latin America. So that was essentially. So yes, these are technologies, innovations, processes, practices that have been tested across these regions, not just these countries.
Correct. And similarly, Sweta was asking, how many of these innovations are context specific versus generalizable.
Right, I'm reading thank you, Sweta. Do you think these really need to be? Yeah, I think, Sweta, that's a very, very good question because, let me just take an example of cooling technologies. Everybody will agree cooling is a huge issue when it comes to markets in many of the countries, where there's a lot of food loss occurring, particularly of perishable items. But I think we have to be careful about sort of pushing forward and saying, oh, these are all the innovations on cooling that have been tested in all these other contexts until you understand the context you're in. And for those of you who, there is someone who is working on understanding food systems transformations, a journalist who's looking at cooling technologies, and it's just published in the New Yorker. And I'm sorry, I'm quoting this, having just read this yesterday. The issue, the whole focus of that article is on how could a cold chain be developed in Rwanda. And as you sort of unpackage what the constraints are in a country like Rwanda, you realize that in fact, you can't just take a set of technologies or processes or practices and just move them to another country. So I think, I don't know whether that answers your question, Sweta, but some innovations and technologies have been tested across many countries, and they are interesting to consider, but context specificity is very needed.
And that's not just climate and so on, the market conditions, the policy frameworks and so on. can affect that.
Yeah, and I think Will just posted that in the chat box if anybody wants to read that. It's a fabulous piece that really sort of highlights the issue at hand if you're thinking about scaling up of something like pooling technologies in a country like Rwanda.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, very useful. And of course, the more behavior change interventions can be somewhat generic in approach, but need to be very tailored in content. Right?
Thanks, Will, for posting that.
Yeah. Any other questions? I mean, so more broadly going forward, as I said, there's going to be consultations in those countries. We welcome everyone who's working in this space to be in touch. Let us know about things that we're potentially missing or should be aware of. One of the reasons why there's more innovation on the production side is that there's been a lot more research investment in innovation in the production side over many decades than post-farm gate technologies. Kudos to USAID for funding several innovation labs that are post-farm gate focused on food safety and food loss and waste. But globally, it's an area that has somewhat been relatively neglected. And then the domain even further downstream through distribution, wholesale, retail, and shifting consumer demand needs a lot more attention to generate empirical evidence of what works. So, yeah, there's a lot of work to be done in this space. Any other comments or questions from the audience? I don't see anything. I do see Ahmed pointing out, the focus on Rwanda in that Africa co-chain, yeah. Supported by including UNEP, and so that brings us again back to their to Emmanuel's point about the producer end of things. How do you, and that's not just about the production of the innovation, as I said, it's about delivery mechanisms. How do you find ways to deliver innovation that goes beyond a non-governmental organizational project, for example, or a UN-supported program, or a government program? So what are the business models that are going to make delivery of innovation cost-effective at a large scale? That's very much a live question. I'm not seeing any other questions. Building innovations is difficult. Criteria for bundling, that would be nice. That would be building on the thought exercise that Shivani highlighted, which really is just the beginning in thinking through how could you bring together complementary types of innovations in a bundle that could work together or fill a gap to allow an innovation to succeed in different contexts. And I think that is going to be the future in terms of both applied research and its translation into practice. Any thoughts on that, Shivani?
Yeah, no, I think that was, I think you articulated that very well. I do feel that where you're working in a little bit of a blank space and you're kind of starting this idea, but that, this is where probably more research is needed on what, understanding what's feasible and what's not, and maybe more thought exercises and experiments on this topic of innovation bundling.
Mm-hmm. Well, we have a few minutes left, but I think I will maybe bring this to a close, give people 5 minutes back. Thanks everyone for joining. This was really an update on where the things stand. Look out for a first round call for proposals within a week or two. And we're, as I said, very, very open to partnership and collaboration in the target geographies as well as globally. This complex agenda requires an all hands on deck approach. And there's a lot to be figured out and thought through. And very much appreciate everyone's engagement in all of this. Shivani, thank you for presenting and making it so clear to everyone.
Great, thanks, Patrick, and thanks everyone. A really good feedback and Q&A. Thanks all.
And with that, we'll bring to a close and look out for future webinars. Take care. Be safe.